I think I owe Earthrise CLIFFJUMPER a bit of an apology. For all the gripes I have about the size and the parts forming, that figure is at least fully functional and looks good in both modes. That's not exactly high praise, but much like anyone in the year of our Lord 2021, I've seen just how worse things can get. Welcome to Kit Katastrophe. My name is Kit, and today we'll be taking a look at Transformers Studio Series Deluxe Class CLIFFJUMPER. This figure was released in 2020 as part of Wave 10 of the Deluxe assortment, and is a heavy retool of Studio Series Off-Road Bumblebee. This figure represents CLIFFJUMPER's appearance in the 2018 film Bumblebee. CLIFFJUMPER's alternate mode is just a palette-swapped version of the one which Bumblebee was seen using in the opening of his titular film. Considering CLIFFJUMPER wasn't seen transforming at all during his scant screen time, this is a pretty fair assumption to make. If such a scene did exist, it was probably cut. This Cybertronian car form significantly harkens back to the War for Cybertron Bumblebee design from 2010, except flattened and lengthened, evoking something more suited for speed than agility. There's a strip of unpainted translucent plastic running down the center mass of the car, flanked at the rear by some aerodynamic fins, making this vehicle have a passing resemblance to Anthracite from Acceleracers. Hell, I'd buy it. The front slopes low to the ground, and there's a nicely painted gunmetal air vent at the bumper. I'm not sure how I feel about the half-open, half-closed wheel design. It just looks somewhat unfinished to me. I'd have preferred an entirely closed wheel design for consistency, but I understand that would interfere with the torso mass in robot mode, but that doesn't mean I can't bitch about it nonetheless. I like the wheels themselves, as they've got a cool design that looks even better when it spins, but it's just a shame that they're pegged on in the most disgusting manner. The front pegs are even made of clear plastic. I wonder how many copies of this figure exist out there with broken or chipped front wheel pegs because of it. Now, I mentioned that CLIFFJUMPER is a retool of Off-Road Bumblebee, but you'd never guess it because all of the shared parts are only really visible in robot mode. Also, CLIFFJUMPER forms the alternate mode backwards compared to Bumblebee. Still, you'd never guess just by comparing them side by side. Before we move on to the transformation, CLIFFJUMPER has some dedicated weapons storage in the cavity between his robot mode legs, whereby his gun tabs into two slots on the inside of the roof. It's a very fickle connection, and on my copy it's prone to popping out. The first thing you'll find out about CLIFFJUMPER by transforming him is that he's a shell former. The entire roof of the alternate mode disconnects from the rest and folds up in a shitty backpack. Pretty much the entire flanks hinge themselves around the calves and condense to form some stumpy little legs, which is something I would normally commend a figure for doing, but CLIFFJUMPER just handles it so poorly. For starters, all the panels are extremely fiddly, and absolutely nothing locks in place. Yes, there are some guiding tabs and slots for things to rest against each other, but as for anything solid, you're out of luck. Second, the vent panels are attached to some clear plastic rods that necessarily have to flex a little each conversion, which really make me fear for the longevity of these joints. Studio Series CLIFFJUMPER seems to have this fixation on using clear plastic for everything just for the sake of some headlights and a strip along the top, which would have been much better if simply painted silver, meaning everything from the knee down, as well as the backpack and chest plate, will be areas to watch in the coming years. The similarity to Off-Road Bumblebee is most apparent in the way his arms and torso come together, as the engineering is lifted whole cloth from the original figure, with most of the components being the same. I really don't like how the hinge joints for his chest panels are detented while Bumblebee's weren't. It results in these panels being a lot tighter to move, and thus more prone to possible breakage. CLIFFJUMPER's robot mode, at a glance, is pretty good. The proportions are just right for this small Autobot warrior, slightly pudgier than Bumblebee's more boxy aesthetic. Though since CLIFFJUMPER is being repainted into B127, this isn't so much a difference of character, but a difference of mode. It's just a shame about that backpack, which sticks out way further than it really has any right to due to its convex nature. The new head sculpt is nice and screen accurate, but the detail is more than a little soft and mushy. The chest plate is entirely fake, as it was on Bumblebee, but honestly, I'm not even mad. You know why? Because faux parts are the least of this figure's worries. I've already mentioned it during the transformation, but these lower legs are just absolute garbage. The outer panels will unseat themselves from the guiding tab at a moment's notice, and the inner panels have chunks of wheel well that bang together, meaning CLIFFJUMPER can't take a regular stance without overlapping parts. Like, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it bugs me. On Off-Road Bumblebee, his flight stand port was on a piece connected to his waist by a double hinge. On CLIFFJUMPER, the flight stand port is on his backpack, so the piece was removed, but the hinge opening wasn't removed from the tooling, making what looks like a severe prolapse. Overall, I just kinda hate handling this figure, and it really drags down my opinion of him. CLIFFJUMPER's sole accessory is a copy of Off-Road Bumblebee's gun cast in black, with added silver paint on the barrels. Funnily enough, this is the only thing I feel CLIFFJUMPER improves from Bumblebee, since the gun just looks really good now. Of course, it's still keyed to only work on CLIFFJUMPER's right arm, so no dual wielding for you. CLIFFJUMPER has that really weird neck joint that Off-Road Bumblebee had, where it's technically a ball joint, but it acts as a swivel, and it just has left and right rotation. It doesn't really have any up and down rotation besides a slight wag. It's on a hinge that allows him to look up, but that unseats his neck from his shoulder line, which is very unnatural. Speaking of unnatural, there's a hinge mostly for transformation, but it allows CLIFFJUMPER to look up that isn't really on the same axis that a typical head would be on at this angle, so it just looks really weird. CLIFFJUMPER's shoulders and the rest of his arms are the same as Off-Road Bumblebee's, and they have the same amount of range on this ball-jointed shoulder, this bicep swivel, and this elbow bend that just goes over 90 degrees. The waist is the same as on Bumblebee, though I think it's a little more impeded on CLIFFJUMPER just because of all of this shit behind his ass, but it does get a nice natural bend, which is very good. The hips are also the same as Bumblebee's. They go forward and they go backward, not that much because of the back kibble. They are less impeded on Off-Road Bumblebee, but they do go outwards just as far, and there is a nice thigh swivel. The knees bend less than 90 degrees, which is quite a shame, but if you unseat this panel, which isn't that hard to do, just look at that, that's so easy, you can get a more reasonable bend out of the knee, and it closer approximates 90 degrees. So there are ways you can work around his limitations in this regard. Finally, at the foot, there is a ball joint at the ankle proper, and it's connected to a hinge that moves forward and backward. And there's also this flap on his ankle that's there for transformation and screen accuracy that can move forward, but if you bring his foot back down, you have to bring the panel back down by yourself. So, CLIFFJUMPER is basically a clone of Off-Road Bumblebee just because he shares so many of the essential joints, but he is a little more limited than his mold mate. As you can see, the leg can move a little further back, and there's just more range in a lot of these joints, like in the ankle and such. And the knee bends more than 90 degrees on Bumblebee, so CLIFFJUMPER is just a more limited version of Bumblebee. So why would you get CLIFFJUMPER? CLIFFJUMPER is easily one of the worst Studio Series figures I own. He lures you in with a great-looking alternate mode and a passably competent robot mode aesthetic, but once you actually pick him up off a shelf, you pass the point of no return. CLIFFJUMPER feels fragile, flimsy at times, and generally nowhere near as fun as his mold mate. It's sorta like that movie where there are two twins where one gets all the good genes and the other gets all the bad genes, but in physical plastic form. I honestly can't even believe that CLIFFJUMPER and Off-Road Bumblebee are cut from the same cloth at times. You all know my opinion of Bumblebee is extremely high enough that I put him on my top 20 of last year. But CLIFFJUMPER, this is a figure you should just ignore. If you like this video or otherwise found it helpful or informative, then please subscribe for more reviews like this in the future, and feel free to suggest topics for future reviews in the comments. When we return, we'll be taking our first steps into the strange world of selects, with a mold that should be familiar to everyone. This has been Katastrophe. Transform and roll out.